higher in the 21st century. Hard-working people working hard for you and me. Moving higher, time and time again. Through the years you'll find us here. Moving higher.
Hello and welcome to Moving Iron Podcast. This edition of Moving Iron Podcast is brought to you by Tractor Zoom, delivering insights. And I have Kyle McMahon, the founder of Tractor Zoom, on here with us. And he comes on about once a month to kind of talk about what's going on in the marketplace and what we see happening out there. So Kyle, welcome to the show, man. How you been?
Good. Thanks for having me on, Casey.
No problem.
Surprised to wake up here in Iowa with about an inch of snow.
Well, moisture. You guys have been getting good moisture out your way, or has it been fairly dry?
You know, this last weekend we got about an inch, but before that, it's been relatively dry.
Yeah, we could use some moisture out here my way too. But so Kyle comes on. Let's talk about what Tractor Zoom is real quick. Refresh everybody what Tractor Zoom is and what it is that you're doing over there.
Yeah, certainly. So we're Tractor Zoom is a website and mobile app where farmers go to find farm equipment at auction. We have just under 400 auctioneers that advertise their farm equipment auctions on Tractor Zoom. So it's a one-stop shop for farmers to go find that equipment. And then we also have another company called Iron Comps, which is powered by Tractor Zoom data. And Iron Comps is where people can go to see auction results and granular detail and figure out what the current market conditions are doing, backed by auction market data.
Right on. Okay, so the one thing I like about what Iron Comps and Tractor Zoom brings to the table is I'm a data nerd when it comes to this stuff. So everything that I can find that gives me an insight to what's happening in any segment of the marketplace helps me understand what's going on and helps me better decide what's happened. So Tractor Zoom is one of those things that I have found that and Iron Comps is one of those things that I've found that gives me that information. So Kyle's going to go through some slides here that kind of outline what it is that we're doing. So one of the biggest questions that I get, whether it's from customers or from just people in the industry, is, is the PTO really worth the amount of money that you have to spend to get it? Or any option for that matter, right? So you're trying to get a guy to put, four-wheel drive combines is another thing. There's certain pockets where you can't sell one without it. And then there's pockets like out here where I'm at, for example, if it's got it on there, no one gives you any more money for it than if it didn't. So it's one of those things that kind of go back and forth. Another thing is wheeled four-wheel drives compared to a track machine. And so for today's show, Kyle's going to go over, is the juice worth the squeeze on getting that PTO? And then where is the difference lying in wheel tractors compared to track machines? So Kyle, run us through what you got here and show us some of the data and some of the power behind Tractor Zoom and Iron Comps.
Yeah, certainly. So I'll share my screen here. And the first thing that we'll go over is the PTO. As you were talking about it, PTO can be one of those expenses when you're buying new. Do you really want to justify the expense? Well, I think what you'll find in the data I'm about to present is what will allow you to make that decision. So I won't jump to any conclusions yet. We'll let the data help show you. So what we're doing here is looking at all tractors over 300 horsepower that are either track machines or four-wheel drive, and they could be from any make: Case IH, Challenger, John Deere, New Holland, whatever it might be. So the first slide we're going to look at, and this is a depreciation graph. Every dot you see here, and by the way, all the graphs I'm going to be showing you over the next 30 minutes or so look very similar to this. So every dot is an auction result. So this is a piece of equipment that is sold at auction. And here we're pulling out key attributes about each. So all of the yellow orange dots are all tractors with a PTO, and all the blue dots are tractors without a PTO. So what you can quickly see here is the other thing I should mention is on the left-hand side of this graph is the price, the auction price, and then down below is the sum of hours. So how many hours are on that machine when it's sold. So here you get a good depreciation graph of what the values of that equipment do over time. And then we're overlaying PTO, yes or no, to understand, is it worth it? So if we're looking at all data throughout, the last 2.5 years that we've been collecting these auction results, you can quickly see that early on, you see some parity of people not really wanting to pay any more for a tractor that has a PTO or not. But you can quickly see that gap widens once you get to that 3,000 to 9,000 hour range. Those used tractors, people are paying a significant amount of money more for that tractor with a PTO. So, for example, if you look at the widest part of the graph, 5,000 hours, there is about a $23,000 price difference between tractors with and without a PTO. People are paying $23,000 more for a tractor with a PTO. What do you think about that, Casey?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, kind of the top end of your graph I was kind of studying here. I mean, it looks like, oddly enough, the tractors that are very low hour are undervalued compared to a non-PTO unit as you start out. But as it widens out, you see that gap comes in. I think the the amount of used buyers that we have out there right now that are trying to source that like new feel, not necessarily hour wise, but they're really dialed into a spec that they're looking for, and they're going to buy the tractor with the spec on it. They want kind of damn the hours to some extent, but they're going to pay closer to attention to the spec, and a lot of it is that used buyer has no intentions of selling it off in a year or two. That this is going to be a machine they're going to keep for 5 or 6 or 7 years, and I think this data kind of shows that they're more dialed in onto that PTO. And obviously, as you see, the widest part of that graph is at probably between 5,000 and 6,000 hours.
Yeah,
that's when you're really seeing the most bang for your buck when it comes into to what that looks like. So this makes a lot of sense to what I've seen happen in the marketplace.
Okay, so again, this is the last 2 years of data. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and let's look at the last year of data. Now it's a little bit different story. Your lower hour, maybe more late model equipment, people are paying more for that PTO.
Yeah.
So it could be a buyer's mentality shift or farming practice shift as more guys are hauling manure tanks and more guys are hauling big grain carts. That PTO early on is really worth it. And then you can see it retains its value pretty much to parity all the way throughout the graph. And then the other thing I want to mention here is there's a good amount of data here for you to look at. There's a good amount of tractors that have sold with and without a PTO. So this is a really powerful graph, in my opinion, that should allow people to make good purchase decisions on that PTO when it's new.
Yeah. No, that's the other side of that too, is the expense that comes along with the bigger 4-wheel drive tractors that we see. You're spending $300,000 or more on something like that. Looks like auction values are holding in there around that in the mid $200,000 range for a lower hour rig. So if you really start to kind of put dollars to use, buying a $400,000 or $300,000 or even a $250,000 tractor that you're going to have a single use for really doesn't make a lot of sense. So the PTO thing really gives it that whole kind of another level of use, whether it's, like you said, the grain cart thing is where I think a lot of this is starting to really play in more than anything, is the size of the grain carts are getting bigger, and the weight and distribution of that weight, and not so much the horsepower, because the horsepower is there on some of these row crop tractors, but it's the weight and getting it moving around if you're in sloppy conditions and those kind of things. especially a track machine, is starting to kind of poke its head up when you start looking at grain cart use.
The other thing that I think paints an interesting picture in this graph is as you get to that 6 to 10,000 hour range, obviously the depreciation really slows down on that machine. There appears to be more inventory that did not have a PTO. So if you think of supply and demand, if that buyer is really looking for a PTO'd machine, there's going to be less of them for sale, which also helps elevate the price, right? Supply and demand is going to tell you if a guy can't find exactly what he wants and he's trying to find the right price range, he's going to pay up a little bit more because he knows he can put that PTO to use.
Yep. A second here. I got jacked up here. Exactly what happened. I think I can edit. Okay. All right. I got all the stuff you just said. We'll just bounce off to the your next slide there.
Okay, so if we get, this is a good overall. These are all makes and models. So if we start to break it down a little bit further, we're going to break it down into John Deere, Case IH, and Challenger tractors. 3 good segments I think we should look at from a PTO if it's worth it once you get down to the specific brand. Now, this graph, obviously in the very beginning it tells you, hey, I shouldn't be buying a tractor with a PTO if I don't need it.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as it hits that 3,000 hours, suddenly it's paid for itself. And the other thing that I think shows here is we've seen some higher dollar, low hour tractors sell without a PTO, and some of those new RX tractors from John Deere, which shows in this graph that they're obviously more expensive, but it throws off that beginning piece.
Right.
Once you get into the meat and potatoes of the data down low, call that 2,000 hour range throughout the 10,000, then you really start to see that PTO being worth it. And again, this is year-over-year data.
So yeah, that would make a lot of sense, especially when you start thinking about how the 2,000 hour 9RX isn't really in existence yet, and there's not been that many higher hour RXs that have been sold at auction yet. So when I mean higher, I mean more than 1,500 hours type of thing. So I can see where that curve kind of makes some sense. I bet you if you took the RXs out of that curve would look very similar to the previous slide that you showed.
It very well could, because when we look at Case IH and the next slide, Challenger, they paint the same picture as what the overall graph did, is a PTO is always worth it. Yeah. Now here you see guys, there's a little bit more volume, more supply at the lower hour machines here, but guys are wanting to purchase those primarily quad-track tractors with a PTO.
It's funny how that narrows on those case tractors, how that narrows between that 4,000 and 6,000 range, where your previous slide data supported that's when it was the most valuable.
Yep. Part of me wants to say that there could be the construction guy's probably better than I do.
Yeah.
I could see, since that case tractor is really popular from a scraper version, those construction guys, he's usually running pretty hard until that mid 3,000 to 7,000 hour range. I can see a lot of scraper tractors being pumped into the market right there. That's why you see more volume and at a lower price.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. Those construction tractors more times than not don't have PTOs on them. I mean, like infinitely more times than not.
Right.
So yeah, that's a good point, especially when it comes to the construction side of it. Yeah. Yeah, and the case quad track does have a pretty good kind of a niche, I guess, marketplace when you start looking at what's going on in the construction market, for sure.
All right, when we sit back and look at Challenger tractors, it's generally speaking, it's a similar story as what we were projecting. To get enough data in here, I actually pulled the last 2.5 years. You don't quite get that more real time or the last year of data, but we needed enough data to make sense. What I do want to point out is look at the volume of dots of the orange or yellow, which are the tractors that have a PTO. By and large, there's not a lot of Challenger tractors in the market that we're seeing that are being sold without a PTO. And when they do, man, that's a pretty variable price all the way throughout there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they speckle in there, kind of hit or miss. I mean, let's take this one for example. They ran around almost probably looks about 6,800 hours or so. There's about 3 machines in that column, and they range from 60 grand down to less than 20. So
yeah,
it's that's pretty. So that's a pretty big swing. But it could be, excuse me. Also goes back to at 6,000 hours. If that's a track machine, the tracks need to be replaced on it. And the undercarriage needs to have some work done to it, and those kind of things. I can see it taking a beating pretty bad on those. Flip side of this too, kind of back to the case side with the Challenger brand and their connection to Caterpillar dealerships. Those Challenger tractors, especially track machines and higher horsepower 4-wheel drives, have a pretty prominent feel in the construction side of the business too. When whether it's pulling pans or whatever it is that they're doing, those tractors do have more of a presence on the construction side. So as you start looking at value, at value of those machines, that a machine that's got 6,000 hours worth of construction work on it compared to 6,000 hours worth of ag work on it, there's going to be a dynamically different value when you start looking at auction value.
Yeah, there certainly could be. All right, so this is the last slide we have on PTO. I think what you saw in the last 5 slides was PTO, generally speaking, holds its value.
Yeah.
Regardless of the brand and regardless of the market. So let's jump into tracks versus wheels. Probably a little bit more expensive option from the factory. Would you say that's generally speaking that would be right, Casey?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Depending on the 2-track or 4-track system, it goes up way up from the price. But that being said, the systems aren't any more. One's not more expensive to maintain than the other. I don't think. I mean, you start looking at dollars versus replacing 8 tires compared to replacing tracks and undercarriage. I mean, anymore, it's getting fairly close to some parity there. So there is a value difference between the two.
All right. So here again, I don't think we're busting any myths, but we're putting data to confirm what I would generally see as most people would agree with. Tracks, because they're more expensive from the factory, retain their value. And when we look at all manufacturers above 300 horse, only the track versus wheel models. So it's going to be like, for example, a John Deere 9510R versus John Deere 9510 RT. Mm-hmm. We excluded any tractor that would be MFW, obviously, in here, and really only comparing the 4-wheel drives if they came with a track versus a wheeled option.
Yeah.
A lot more data, as you can see here. It's pretty evident, no matter where you look at this graph, people are paying more for tracks.
Yeah.
But conversely, what we saw in the PTO, once you hit that 4,000 to 7,000 hour range, people are paying a little bit less for track machines and paying a little bit closer to parity from a wheeled machine.
Yeah. Another thing too, about your graph right here, when I'm looking at it, is how the top end of the graph is heavily loaded with track machines, and as the machines get older, the amount of data that you have for 4-wheel drives greatly dominates the track data. I mean, there's way more wheeled machines in that 4,000 to 7,000 or even 8,000 hour range than there is between the 0 to 4,000 hour range when you're looking at the number of data points. So it's kind of curious about why that is.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're looking at that front side of the graph between 0 and 2,000 hours,
Yeah.
look at the depreciation curve of a track tractor over a wheeled tractor.
Oh, it's pretty steep.
The first
Yeah.
2,000 hours of that track machine appears to be pretty expensive.
Yeah. Yep. That's the other thing too about those track machines is that, especially a 2-track system, is it's niche to an area. You know what I mean? Certain areas have more draw for a track machine than other areas do. If you're up in Minnesota, a track machine's different. It has a different need and a different feel than if you're in central Kansas. You know what I mean? There's that kind of regional aspect plays a big part of that too.
All right, when we look, so this is the last 2.5 years of data. Now, if we look at the last year of data, painting dang near the same picture.
Yeah.
Of still steep depreciation curve for a track tractor as compared to a 4-wheel drive tractor up front.
Yeah.
And then once you get to that 4,000 to 10,000 hours, as you were saying, it's still heavily dominated by the wheeled machine versus the track machine.
Yeah.
And you still see that gap close between 5,000 and 6,000 hours.
Yeah.
You know, Casey, we were talking about this before we got on here. Of when you looked at this, are buyers really willing to pay more for, or is the mentality that a buyer's willing to pay more for a wheeled machine in that 5,000 to 7,000 hour range as you see the gap closes over a track machine because you have more maintenance on tractor then? Because then you see that gap get wider in later hours in the life cycle.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, if you look at any machine, there's hour ranges that pop into place that make a big difference in what the machine value looks like. Track tractors being one of those. So when you start to hit about 4,000 hours is when you kind of start to see, well, from 3,000 to 4,000 hours is when you start to see that trend line start to narrow. And that's about the place where you're going to start doing some 3,000 hours to 4,000 hours. You're replacing tracks, you're doing those kind of things. And then from 4,000 hours on into like that 5,000 to 6,000 hour range, you're probably replacing tracks again, and you're doing some undercarriage work or more extensive undercarriage work at that point. So that doesn't make a little sense that you would see something like that happen. But I think it is kind of how sharp even towards the whole life cycle of the track machine, how just the depreciation curve is. I mean, if you look at the wheeled tractor side of it, that depreciation curve stays kind of, you see your typical depreciation, and then it kind of starts to kind of flatten out there at the bottom. But there again, between that 5,000 hour and 8,000 hour range, the number of wheeled versus track machines you see out there is it's almost probably 2 or 3 to 1 that you see anywhere else. That's quite impressive how that works. How that is. It's just interesting to see that the front side of the graph so full of track machines, and then the bottom side of the depreciation curve so full of 4-wheel drives. So that's pretty interesting.
With the graphs I'm going to show you the next 2 slides, I'm going to show you the John Deere specific and then the Case IH specific. What I will be really curious to see, Casey, is this graph in a year or 2 years, once there's been more John Deere RX, 9RX tractors in the market.
Yeah.
Because what I'm about to show you is the John Deere 2-track system. When you look at tracks versus wheels, you have a big depreciation curve in the very beginning.
Right.
And then when I show you the next slide, which is Case IH, you don't have as big of a depreciation curve up front. I'm curious if that's the buyer's willingness to purchase a John Deere 9RT versus a quad track.
Yeah. Yeah, the 9RX, they're only having about 3 seasons under its belt, right? 3. Yeah, I think it's 3. It's the third or fourth production year for it. It's it is it's a different animal out there from a data point perspective because there's not that many to throw out there. If you go,
Correct.
So I think that might, what you're seeing there might just be a little bit of that, but there again, not too many of those have been put on auction either. So it's not.
And yeah, what I'm getting at is I think you're going to see the depreciation curve of those 9R potentially, right? So it's my hypothesis is you'll see the depreciation curve follow trend line more like this wheeled machine does versus have this big drop. And then obviously there's more data points of wheeled machines later in the life cycle of these tractors. But when you look at just the RX, I would speculate that they're going to follow what we are seeing in the last year of Case IH. You see this parity throughout the first part of the life cycle, and you see less of a gap, or more of a gap rather, at that 5,000 to 7,000 hour range.
Yeah.
Okay, before we get into this graph too far, I have to let you know that Case IH tractors don't actually skyrocket in value after 7,000 hours. So what this polynomial graph is showing is there is no more data for a Case IH tractor after 8,000 hours right now, tracks versus wheels, or rather track machines. And you see this big clump of 4 auction results at that 8,000 hour range.
Yeah.
This data is recognizing, hey, you see some uptick in the market there. Because there's no data points, it just goes up. So for all of you red fans out there, don't think your track machine goes up in value too quickly.
It's worth 8,000 hours is worth as much as new. So it's just hold on till 8,000 hours.
Yeah. But look at the gap on these. Look at the gap on, like, no matter where you look in this graph, that track machine is dang near almost always worth more.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is why I speculated in the last graph, if we get John Deere data put in here for their 4-track system, is the depreciation curve and parity going to look more like this?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah. Back to the John Deere one, I mean, the number of machines that you have at the above $300,000 range down to $230,000 range, there's $100,000 spread there between your data points, and it drops off pretty quick. So that could be driving some of that sharp curve that you see there anyway. But with the majority of those being track machines, you got to think those are RXs up there that are up there high in that high dollar range.
Yeah, well, we can look at that data here in a moment.
Okay.
Have we made a pretty good case for all makes and models and John Deere and Case IH that
I think so.
People almost always pay more for tracks versus wheels, but that gap does narrow for most machines in that 4,000 to 7,000 hour range, where you pay just a little bit more for tracks, maybe $10,000 to $12,000 more for tracks in that hour range, versus up front where you're paying $25,000 to $50,000 more.
Yeah, no, this has made a pretty good case that if you're going to get a track machine, you're gonna at least keep the majority of the difference between a wheel machine and a track machine.
Okay, now let's break it down a little bit further and just look at late model 8R and 9R tractors. So this is, again, tracks versus wheels in those two model classes. This is your 8R, 9R, and RTs, but does not include RX tractors. So now we have three comparisons here. The last 2.5 years of data. If you see the 4-wheel drive and the MFWD are very close in value throughout their life cycle, whereas you see the tracks start high cost, the cost new of those are more expensive. But then as they get later in their life cycle, they actually cross what the values of those four-wheel drives and the wheeled machines are, and actually goes below.
Yep. Yeah, the MFWD tractor, though, it's one of those kind of bread and butter type thing. The number of those that get produced in a year are staggering compared to the other two. So the data points are going to be very close together. But it is interesting to watch the four-wheel drive, how it mirrors the value of the MSWD through the majority of its life cycle, then it kind of falls off the table there at the end. But how consistent the depreciation curve is on a MFWD. It's very obviously you start out with your high depreciation towards the left side of the graph, but as you move to the right, it stays. It's a very gradual, consistent drop in depreciation value. It's pretty interesting.
Totally. And then the other thing to look at the right side of this graph, after the 4,000 hours, look how many more MFWD tractors there are.
Yeah.
So 8R tractors versus 9Rs.
Yeah, there's quite a few. That is impressive. The number of data points that are out there for MFWD comparatively to the rest of the world.
So coming to a conclusion on John Deere, tracks versus wheels.
Mm-hmm.
The tracks are depreciating quicker off the get-go, and they depreciate further in their life cycle. MFWD and four-wheel drive, so all the wheeled machines are pretty close in value throughout the entire life cycle, the depreciation curve. But, what you had mentioned of that depreciation curve of the MFWD wheeled machines on the 8Rs really flatten out from 2,500 hours. That's a pretty consistent percent drop from, call it 2,500 hours all the way out to 8,500 hours.
Yeah. Yep. That is impressive how they maintain the value that they got comparatively.
And then if we look at just 8R and 8RT tractors, painting the picture a little bit more of what we were seeing earlier, but getting more granular over the last 2 years of auction data, you see tracks again cross the value of what an MFWD tractor is.
Right.
The thing I will point out is there's a lot more 8Rs selling in the market than 8RTs.
Yeah.
And then Casey, I've always heard you talk about, the bulge in the market. Look at this bulge in the market right here for 8RT tractors between that 1,500 hour and 3,000 hours. And you really see that depreciation curve speed up at that point in time and then level back off.
Yeah. Tracks, replacing tracks on undercarriage work. Which it always kind of to replace a set of tracks on an 8RT or any 2-tractor system that out there is going to cost you 30 grand or better to do something like that. 20 to 30 grand to do something like that, depending on what brand you're buying, those kind of things. Then you sprinkle in some undercarriage work, you might spend another, if you have to replace a bunch of bogies and those kind of things, you probably spend another $5,000 to $10,000 depending on what you're doing there. So you could have upwards of 50 grand in doing all that, and it would be on a MFWD dualed in the front and dualed in the back. You're going to have 20, 30,000 bucks, probably pretty easy wrapped up in that. So you are saving some money doing it that way. The difference in tires is cheaper to operate than track machines. But then I'll go back to my previous statement that those where they use a row crop track machine, is so niche that in those specific areas, I bet this graph would be inverted in areas where they grow a lot of potatoes and those kind of things because of the amount of two-track systems.
That is a good point.
So niched. It's so niche to certain areas. What they're doing. Not impressed. I mean, it's just the sheer number of and the consistency of the data points on mechanical four-wheel drives make a big difference comparatively to what you see on the track side of the graph.
Yeah. All right, if we keep moving here and we look at the 9R, 9RT, no RX. We'll show you the RX in a second. I think we will. I think I have that on my next slide. So here you see the same story as what we just saw in the 8Rs to some degree of the tracks crossing the value of the four-wheel drives. But there's more 9RTs than 9Rs later in the life cycle.
Yeah.
So buyers have more opportunity to purchase a 9RT than they are a 9R. That guy really doesn't want tracks, doesn't need tracks, doesn't think he needs to pay for it. Might psychologically think that he's going to pay more for a track machine when he's going to auction, when he's looking at auctions. Ends up paying more for a wheeled machine because there's less of them out there.
Yeah. And those data points are you take those kind of 4 or 5 data points up there on the four-wheel drive out of the mix, down there in that 3,000 to 5,000 hour range.
Right here?
No, on the 3,000 to 5,000.
Oh, sorry, gotcha.
Take those 5 data points out, and you're going to have a pretty much a pretty equal depreciation line that you would see. They'd almost be the same.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting. I think there's more. The 9RT, it has gained popularity since 2015. So I think there's a pretty good opportunity there to make some. If you were looking for one, I think there's a great opportunity for you to find some out there, some higher hour rates. That's an interesting graph too.
You know, I used to live in northern Iowa, big pig country. I'd see guys running 9RTs over 9Rs all the time. Most of those guys were hog producers. They're running those 9RTs double time in the fall, running a grain cart, and then they're starting to haul manure with them.
Yeah.
I don't know if we see some goofy things at auction where guys don't clean their tractors and so forth. Maybe a guy pulled up in the auction in one of those 9RTs and still covered full of hog manure.
Man,
doesn't look all that great.
Yeah. Yeah, those don't sell very well.
All right, let's dive into with RX machines. So with the four track system, what you see here,
In line.
and we were alluding to it earlier. You look at the very front of this graph on the left hand side, top left. Those RX machines are pretty new, more pricey. I think you're seeing guys just looking at these 9RXs at the very top. So I wanted to put this slide in here, but there's such a price difference from the factory from an RX to just a 9R, so like a four-wheel drive tractor. This graph gets thrown off a little bit. We need some more data in the market with 9RX tractors to really paint an accurate picture here, because I don't think this does anybody justice of, hey, I'm gonna go buy a wheeled machine over a 4-track machine. I want to make sure we put that disclaimer in here. I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to see what the RXs are doing when you compare it here, but I don't think it's fair with a lack of data from a RX tractor between that 2,000 hours and 8,000 like you have on these other machines. So want to show you, but you see that depreciation graph really go quick, and I don't think it does those RX tractors justice.
No, just you front load the front side of it, and then there's nothing after.
Totally.
So the trend lines are going to be kind of jacked up there a little bit.
So let's not spend too much time in this. Let us dive into Steigers. Tracks versus wheels. So this is all Steiger. Any Steiger tractor made that had the option of tracks versus wheels, we threw it in this graph, and this is the last, call it 2.5 years of data. Man, there's a big difference between tracks versus wheel price tags throughout the entire depreciation curve of these tractors. You do see parity get closer in the end, but you know, guys are paying for those quad tracks up front.
Yeah.
And there's a big price difference. I mean, if you look at 2,000 hours, a guy's or 1,500 hours, a guy's spending $65,000 more.
Yeah. Yeah, you have the other thing about this, that is the four-wheel drive side of it, how consistent it stays comparatively to the kind of towards the end of the life cycle, how from about 2,500 hours to 6,000 hours, the depreciation sharpens a little more than what you can see there on the other side, but kind of flattens out on the four-wheel drive, and then it just starts to drop off after about 5,000 hours. So a lot more data points on the track side.
Yeah, there definitely are. And if we throw out the older style Steigers and we look at more late model, I think the if I recall, the later models of Steigers, or the previous model Steigers, were made between 11 and 13, and all the models you see here would be made between 14 and 20, something like that. And I went ahead and include those Steiger model numbers in this graph here. So your 370s, your 470s, 540s, 580s, 620s, and so forth. And again, everybody's paying up for that quad track. And
yeah, it's a pretty straight line. It's a pretty straight line down. You know, it's there's no real kind of bend in that line until you get to about 3,500 hours. It kind of starts to swing back up a little bit, but it's a pretty straight line. Again, more track points, data points than see anywhere else.
Yeah, so that's what I have for PTO and tracks versus wheels. You know, when I look at all the data we just looked at and analyzed, better be buying that PTO from the factory.
Yep.
And depending on what your use case is for a track, that 2-track system with John Deere over the 4-wheel drive is similar in price once it's in that later life cycle, 4,000 to 7,000 hours. And then there's a big price difference between the RX and the R, but I'm assuming you're getting a lot more performance.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's I think the obviously the track versus wheel thing, that looks like, as a rule of thumb, like you said, we kind of proved the myth, didn't bust the myth by any means. So
yeah,
the track machine is going to hold its value comparatively. And but I will say the wheel machines have a more consistent depreciation curve than we see on the track units across their life cycle.
Yeah. So if you read the title of this podcast and think we're going to bust a lot of myths, we didn't, but we put real data to them so you can really understand, to help you make a better buying decision up front. So you really know what your ROI is going to be. And then the other thing that I really want to tell people that are listening is, when we say something is worth more than the other, so people are paying more for a PTO or people paying more for tracks later in the life cycle, don't forget that price premium is not just a price premium, but it also opens up the buyer pool. So when you open up that buyer pool, it becomes more competitive, and that's traditionally why you see higher prices.
Yeah. Yep.
And you can sell that thing faster.
Absolutely. No. Good stuff, man. This is the kind of data that makes used equipment management a lot easier to do. So good stuff here. Well, Kyle, if you wanted to get some more information about iron comps and tractors, what's the best place to do that?
Yeah, if you want to see all the upcoming auctions we have something like 70 auctions going off here in the next few weeks. I think next 2 weeks. So planning season is still here. The coronavirus is still here, but holy cow, there's so much auction inventory out there. It's not funny. So go to tractorzoom.com to look at all the auction inventory. And if you're interested in finding data, comparable sales from the auction market, go to ironcomps.com. And if you want to shoot us a message, shoot me a message at kmcmahon@tractorzoom.com. Or if it's easier to remember, info@tractorzoom.com. I'll get that as well.
Right on. Okay. Well, good stuff, Kyle. Thanks for being on the podcast, and we will talk to you again next month, man.
Thanks, Casey. Appreciate having me.
Right on. So I'm Casey Seymour with Moving Iron Podcast. Make sure you check me out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for all the latest posts and blog posts and podcast posts that I put out there. Also check out movingironllc.com for more information about stuff going on with Moving Iron. And last but not least, check out the Global Ag Network and all the great podcasts out there. So until next time, I'm Casey Seymour with Kyle McMahon. Let's go move some iron, folks. Out.
Moving iron in the 21st century. Hard work.